Hello there. This is Paul Glumaz with 45 years of activity with the LaRouche movement, and this is being brought to you by General Welfare Presents. And today is April the 3rd, 2019, and we are in the post-Mueller report era. There's the pre-Mueller report era, and there's the post-Mueller report era. The post-Mueller report era is very different. You have a lot of motion now towards potential collaboration from some Democrats and some Republicans with the President of the United States on a number of issues. Staying out of, in fact, Ocasio-Cortez and Ilhan, what's her last name?
Omar.
are actually supporting Donald Trump in his ending these wars. So it's a wide open situation, and we're looking at a person of interest who is really the power behind the scenes, and really the puppet string puller, the controller of things, more so than anybody else, historically and also currently. And he's currently 99 years old. His name is George Soros, and he controls Pelosi. He set up the whole thing with Arnold Schwarzenegger. Behind the scenes, he was the one who brought in Dick Cheney to run the Bush administration. This is the guy. This is the key guy. He's 99 and still in control. So we're going to be working on him somewhat, exposing him somewhat. Now, in the post-Mueller report era, Donald Trump has done something which is going to have a profound effect on this country and its future, provided that we get past the nuclear war that we're headed towards, that John Bolton, Mike Pence, and Pompeo intend to get us into. The neocon element. They're like going berserk, trying to wreck everything that Donald Trump is doing with China, with North Korea, etc., with the troop pullouts, with everything. But nonetheless, what Trump has announced is a massive space program with a clear objective. 2024, a man moon landing, back on the moon. 2028, a moon base. It'll involve the government, it'll involve the private sector, and it will involve collaboration with other nations, which implies China, Russia, European countries. But it's a directed effort to go back to the moon and set up a base so that you can go to Mars. So it's a moon-Mars orientation. This is huge. This is going to revive the optimism in the youth, because now we have a direction. We're going to go to Mars. We're going to build a moon to go to Mars. And in the process of solving the scientific problems, we will unleash a scientific renaissance, number one. Number two, this will also increase cooperation among nations. And number three, this is what humanity is meant to do. It's meant to go outside the earth. It's meant to develop the means not only to expand human life and other forms of life outside of the planet, but also to have the means to defend the planet from the most threatening thing that can happen to the planet, which is not climate change. It is an asteroid problem. Asteroid defense, planetary defense. We currently do not have the means to prevent human extinction from a collision by an asteroid. That's serious. But in the course of all doing this, we will revolutionize technology. So this is being done by Donald Trump, and it's serious, and he is behind it, and he's directly involved in promoting it. And it's just the beginning of a different direction for the United States. Many of you may recall that Obama began to actually dismantle the space program. He said we already went to the moon. Why should we go back? Okay. And the point is that if the United States wants to technologically leapfrog and scientifically leapfrog, this is one of the key things it needs to do. If it's not going to do this, what else is it going to do? Where else could it do this? Because what you have right now is the domination of our research budgets on climate change, on things like that. The eco-industrial complex is $1 trillion. Okay, that's all the money that goes to climate change. That's all the companies that are involved. That's all of the lobbying that's on a global scale. It's all the windmills, solar, and all the other stuff that goes with it. It's a $1 trillion scam. The carbon tax is part of it. All of this is a scam. It's a huge scam. What we have in this eco-industrial complex is a looting process where you're diverting credit from the real economy into a not-so-real economy. You're creating jobs, you're creating power, you're creating political, but you're doing it at the expense of the real economy. The same thing is with the drug trade. It's a similar thing. It's the same thing to a large degree with the military-industrial complex. You have an economy of $1 trillion or $2 trillion in the case of the military-industrial complex and the drug trade, and it has a political power attached to it, but it is not oriented towards development. It does not develop your nation. It's the form of empire of the British East India Company that originated in how they treated India in starting in the 1760s. They they were a company. They paid dividends and they looted India. In fact, when they ended up in control of India, they became the most powerful entity in the world, and they started to try to do that with the colonies, and that's when there was a revolution. So we're in the same battle that we've been in since 1763. That battle hasn't changed. You have Benjamin Franklin, who was a follower of Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz developed the concept off of the Renaissance of scientific and technological progress. It was Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz who said, or who was committed to this idea, that you develop a source of power which can run machines that can replace human labor and thereby go beyond the limits of animal and human labor and windmills. That was Leibniz's idea, and Franklin was part of that. Franklin spent a lot of time. Franklin was the greatest scientist of his day. He was a Leibnizian. And the idea of having the colonies, his influence on the colonies, and the idea was to have a situation where people were free to develop those ideas. And the most advanced industries in the world were being developed in the north, in Massachusetts and Pennsylvania and so forth. And what happened was the East India Company influence Crown finally ruled against the development of the economic development of the colonies and made them totally dependent on as raw materials and outlawed any kind of non-primary exploitation, wood, timber, raw materials, tobacco, whatever. And then began to brutally tax them the way they were taxing them in India. The way they did it in India was they put a massive tax in there and they went in and took everything that the Indians had, and they had massive famines. Well, that's what the colonists were facing. And of course, Benjamin Franklin understood who these people were, and he realized that there was no way out but to have a war of independence. But he also realized that the rest of Europe wasn't for this either, so he organized this fight. So ever since Benjamin Franklin's organizing of the European monarchies to support the revolution, it's always been, this fight for science and technology has always been one involving the elements of the United States in collaboration with international elements. Not to essentially keep alive the idea that human beings have a future through scientific and technological development. That was the key. And to the whole situation. Now, Franklin also set up throughout Europe scientific societies, which also dovetailed what Leibniz was trying to do. So that was one aspect of it. The second aspect of it was that Leibniz is involved in receiving reports from China, and he had developed an understanding of Chinese Confucian philosophy and so forth. And he saw the benefit of importing Chinese Confucian philosophy to Europe to deal with a lot of the problems that existed, religious wars and what have you. And it has been discovered that Benjamin Franklin was very familiar with Confucius and considered himself in part a Confucian, among other things. So this is the founder of our nation, or the key, not the only founder, but the key organizer for the foundation of our nation. And this has been the battle. And before Malthus came on the scene, a few years after Franklin, there was a guy in Venice by the name of Jean Maria Ortiz who wrote about population issues, keeping the population down, calling it. And Benjamin Franklin responded by saying, it's the creativity of the human race which makes it possible to continue to develop and exist. And population increase is not a threat, but a benefit. So this same thing that's been going on, with all these zero growth things, with the limits to growth, all of that is going on at the same time that Benjamin Franklin was fighting the British East India Company, who were sponsoring, later sponsoring Parson Malthus, or Malthusianism comes from, which was a plagiarism of Jean Maria Ortiz from Venice's thesis on population. So this thing has been going on since 1763, this particular battle that we are in now. And Trump just issued an order, or issued a direction, which is contrary to the direction of the heirs of the British East India Company, which became the Dutch, and then the Dutch-British East India Company, and then this is what we've been fighting. So the next phase of this battle was over slavery. They were promoting the slave system. They were trying to keep U.S. manufacturers down and promoting the slave system. And then after the defeat of slavery, they started to promote social Darwinism, eugenics, white race, the Ku Klux Klan. All of that comes out of this, the Nashville agrarians later on, which are the third generation of the Ku Klux Klan, was the Nashville agrarians. This is the kind of worldview that they were promoting. This is the European colonial system. And McKinley was opposed to it, and he was killed. Lincoln was opposed to it, he was killed. FDR was opposed to it, and he died in office. And Kennedy was opposed to it, and he's killed. This is the fight. This has been the fight all along. And now China is resurrecting that orientation. It's not because they're communist. They're the only country with a communist party that hasn't collapsed. You think having your country run by a communist party is a successful model, or the only model? No. The Communist Party ran the country, other countries, and run them into the ground. it's not a question of the Communist Party. It's not a question it's a question of the right policies. And the Chinese have figured out what the right policies are. And they have gone back to the kind of policies that the United States had earlier, under Lincoln, and under Hamilton, and under FDR. Okay? The leading negotiator for the Chinese in the trade agreement, Liu He, is an expert in what FDR did. And he's saying, point blank, the problem with the U.S. economy is it needs to be, it's structural. It's structural. It's the way things work. And he calls for a return to FDR. So this is the battle. Okay? And Trump is saying we're going to go back to a science driver, technology oriented. This is LaRouche's fourth law. He's saying that. This is huge. But there's a lot of problems that have to be dealt with. But the fact that that's being put forward as an orientation is very important. Now, the battle with the British East India Company, the continuation of that battle is what we're now in now. And unless you understand that, unless you locate yourself at the center of that battle as center of history, it doesn't make any sense what's going on in the world. And Lyndon LaRouche, on his own, as an individual, put himself in the center of that battle in the middle to late 1970s and became a conduit for a dialogue at the highest level of ideas on economics and policy between elements in the United States that still had that reflex that goes back to the American system, and other elements around the world that had the same reflex. And as Ronald Reagan was coming in, Lyndon LaRouche's influence became very great because he was able to mediate and connect these tendencies into a policy for the Reagan administration, which was in the form of developing the beam defense system to knock out the missiles. But that was the beginning of a collaboration in space and in knocking out missile technology between the U.S. and the Soviet Union that would have ended the Cold, not just begun to end the Cold War, but would have created an orientation for benefiting mankind on a massive scale. And the other guy who agreed with LaRouche on this was Edward Teller, who was not some, so this was what the Soviets rejected when this was proposed to them, and LaRouche was doing the back channel with the Soviets. And that's when that's when the whole attack on LaRouche began. Was massive attack on LaRouche began when it became evident that he had played this role. But what was he doing? He was following in the footsteps of Benjamin Franklin, organizing a conspiracy to defeat the continuation of the British East India Company in all its evil depredations of humanity. He was continuing that tradition as an American. That's what a true American is. So, that's where we are. And that's where we're going. And that's where we intend to take things. To that. And for that to happen, the United States must establish that it is oriented towards a future scientific and technological progress orientation. And it needs to do that if it's going to actually work with other nations. Now, the empire itself is completely freaking out. They're having trouble in Great Britain. They're having trouble in France. Italy is joining the Belt and Road. Luxembourg is joining the Belt and Road. And I was up in Canada the other day, and I got to hear from the top spy, the head of their former head of their intelligence and national security. And he's basically saying, you cannot contain China's development short of nuclear war. Russia is the enemy. But as far as Canada was concerned, Canada no longer has the U.S. as its patron, and no longer has the British Empire as its patron. So what is Canada going to do? What are all these countries that have orientated towards this imperial financial system going to do, since they don't know how the United States is going to manifest itself? So this is huge. This is what's going on. This is what's going on a global scale. And the Trump election and the failure to remove Trump is now starting to bear incredible effects, which are only beginning. So now we have this problem within the Trump base, within the Trump elements, which is the same group that went after Lyndon LaRouche on the right. It was the Heritage Foundation. The same Heritage Foundation is sponsoring the revival of Dick Cheney, is sponsoring Bolton, sponsoring all these people to try to undermine Trump and force Trump into conflicts with China and North Korea, etc. And one of the places they picked to launch their is Venezuela. Now, does anyone really think the United States is going to invade Venezuela and do a regime change? Does anyone think Trump will do that? I mean, would he do that? Well, but what is this Venezuelan thing all about? Well, it's also about activating the reactionary elements within the U.S. that have been brainwashed over 75 years about, communism and socialism and the Chinese, the yellow peril and the Russian bear and all of that. It's, this whole psychotic, the John McCain syndrome, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We got that problem in the population. We got it within the evangelicals. We got it within this element of the population. But it's just a massive propaganda brainwashing for generations. So they're using the Venezuelan thing to activate that, to undermine Donald Trump, to undermine a potential for China and the United States to come to agreement on trade, and then use that as the backbone of dealing with the global banking collapse, which is still pending. We're still looking at that. So that's where we are. And so now this is very big. We are going to have a memorial to Lyndon LaRouche on June 8th in Manhattan. We're going to be webcasting this live. And we will have a place in Seattle where you can come and participate in the Seattle part of that memorial. I'm encouraging you, if you are familiar with LaRouche and you want to pay respects to his passing, to get a hold of me. You'll see on the screen my phone number and my email, and I will get you into the. I'll let you know when that will be and where that will be. There was a week and a half ago an incredible vicious attack on LaRouche. An obituary on LaRouche at the London Times, and this is a paper. This is a publication for the functionaries of the empire, and they're very aware of what we have done. And we have a situation with Mexico, which is also being exacerbated by these organizations, which are money from elements like George Soros, who are organizing these caravans to attack the United States, essentially. These are Village Without Voters, is called pueblos sin fronteras. And this this whole thing is being coordinated with the Venezuelan operation to create an intractable crisis between Mexico and the United States, because the Mexican president is not for the Venezuelan Mexico has never supported any of this kind of stuff. They've always been neutral, and And the pressure coming from the neocons that are being activated is to put pressure on Mexico, which you should not do. And this is disrupting the relationship between Obrador and Trump. This is also a component of the whole Venezuelan thing, is to disrupt the relationship between U.S. and Mexico, which is a much more serious matter, with all these caravans coming up of 10, 20, 30,000 people that are being financed by these, no borders thing. It's very, very dangerous stuff. So Trump is threatening to close the border. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but it's probably a bad thing. But the point is, this is the kind of crisis that the same people that have been trying to impeach or trying to destroy or trying to bring down Trump are now bringing upon him. This is their flank, and it is being coordinated with people like Pence and Bolton. Not obviously, but absolutely yes, because that's they're trying to create a crisis where you essentially you turn the Mexican government against the United States, and then you have the U.S. Intervening or potentially intervening or not intervening or what have you. You have a mess, and what they're discovering is that they're recycling a lot of these children. They're bringing them across the border and sending them back. It's like this is a form of warfare. It's a form of hybrid war against the United States. It's not coming just from the people themselves. It's not coming from the people. It's being organized, and it's being organized by the same people that are killing you with drugs. Ultimately, it's being run by the same people that get the money from killing you with drugs, like George Soros. So this is where we are in history. We are near the end of that period of history that begins with the ascendancy of the British East India Company. And those people haven't changed. They're for depopulation, they're for population reduction, they're for keeping everyone backward, looting, plunder, drugs. It hasn't changed. It's the same thing. And people need to wake up to the fact that it's the exact same thing that Benjamin Franklin was fighting. It's the same thing we're fighting now. And we are on the edge of finally defeating it.